Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernickes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Today's program concludes a conversation with Glenn Mitoma, lecturer at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University. In this episode, Glenn discusses the relationship between human rights education and social justice, how human rights education can address threats to human rights in the United States, the importance of deploying human rights education to counter the growth of authoritarianism in the U.S. and globally, the individuals who inspired him to become a human rights educator, and strategies he recommends to advance human rights education in the U.S. You know, in HRE USA, there's been a pretty vibrant dialogue about this, but the term social justice means different things to different people. So how do you conceptualize the connections between HRE and social justice, particularly since I think it's fair to say we have a rather intensely polarized political landscape in the country today?
This is like a super interesting and difficult question. And I've had this conversation. I used to teach a course on human rights and social justice in education. In my current class in human rights education, we just talked about this amongst my colleagues in the Institute as we're kind of talking about curricular reform. We've talked about this. And I don't know of any good answer. I mean, I think in general, the things that have come out of those conversations is that they are overlapping but distinct fields. And, human rights, I always think of as more formalized, more focused on a set of articulated legal principles, integrated more directly with state actors and obligations, and global in their purview. Social justice is much more closely rooted to local communities, grows out of a experience of injustice and oppression, and is collective in both its vision of what justice requires, and in its mechanisms for achieving justice, right? So they're kind of it goes with social movements, and group rights, and human rights tends to be more individual, right? They're rights of individuals. They tend to be more legal focused in terms of, strategic litigation, going through institutions and that kind of thing. But taken together, though, I think they can be incredibly symbiotic in that human rights give social justice movements a language of and access to mechanisms of power, right? They provide ways of articulating claims that then find audiences, right? The UN, for instance, right? If you can articulate your particular violation in human rights language, you can come and, testify before the Human Rights Council, or you can submit a shadow report to one of the treaty bodies. Or if you're in Europe or some other countries with regional human rights courts, you can bring a lawsuit through a court mechanism. For human rights, though, right? social justice movements provide the ongoing critique of the limits and exclusions within the human rights frame as it exists today. It's only through social justice movements for LGBTQ rights, for instance, that we begin to see a broadening of the principles and practices of human rights at the UN. In 1948, no one was thinking about sexual and gender minorities. And it takes a social movement that says, wait a minute, these too are human rights, for the mechanisms and formal instruments to begin responding to and recognizing them. So, that kind of symbiotic relationship, I think, is what propels both social justice movements to be successful and human rights to be a dynamic force for ongoing change in the world, and not just a kind of ossified document, which is kind of what the problem with sometimes our Constitution is, right? That it's looked at as kind of a sacrosanct document, and these are the words handed down on high from these wise and perfect founding fathers. And so only what exists in that document can be regarded as a true right. Human rights, because it's interfacing directly with social justice movements, tends to be much more flexible in that regard.
Well, I would argue also that the movement for indigenous rights was not something that was seriously considered in 1948 either, but has become a serious worldwide movement. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I think you're right, Bill. That is like the best example of it. Not only because it's about the inclusion of people who were formerly excluded from human rights, but it actually transforms the idea of human rights itself, right? It's through indigenous rights that we begin to go beyond the idea of only individual human rights, so a collective rights, and to go beyond even the notion of human, right? It's through the indigenous rights framework that we talk about the rights of the environment, right? The idea that a river can have rights in some significant way that's, aligned with human rights principles. That really then forces a rethinking, not just a kind of expansion of the existing human rights framework, but a rethinking of the framework in its entirety in a way that I think really serves to advance justice.
So we also live in a period when there are serious threats to fundamental human rights in the United States. I'll just list a few: limits on academic freedom, censorship of publications, restrictions on voting rights, violence against minorities. All these are serious issues, but I'd like you to pick one and talk about how you feel you would deploy human rights education to try to address a specific human rights violation. And if you could talk about children, that would be even more important.
Sure. I mean, I say sure, but it's a good question, and it's tricky. If I think about the kinds of the range of issues faced in our schools today, I think a human rights-based approach rooted in the definition of the rights of the child contained in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which insist on the capacity and necessity of participation by children in decisions that affect their lives. I think this is a really critical opening for addressing those range of issues, whether they are, the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, and the other legislation that is, silencing gender education and targeting transgender students in particular for harassment and bullying, or the kinds of legislation that is preventing an authentic teaching of American history, or the kinds of efforts to get rid of ethnic studies classes or anything else that speaks to particular kinds of identities, or even outside of the kind of most recent developments, that long-term trend of defunding and underfunding and segregating public schools that has led to the closing of music and art classes, the diminishment of extracurricular opportunities, the inequality of access to advanced placement and other intellectually rich courses. All of these things, right, in the kind of fireworks around a lot of what goes on in the cultural wars, gets forgotten, but is a long-term set of human rights concerns within education, all of which would be better addressed if schools and communities centered the voice of young people in their decision making about the education that should go on in those schools. And I think a human rights-based approach, precisely, even though we know that the U.S. is the only country in the world not to have ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, so it's not legally binding. That's all fine and good, but it exists as a vision and a standard for what rights children should have. And I think that many schools, school boards, and others can look to it as, not legal guidance, but a source of inspiration. It would provide a basis for including children's voices in these decisions, and help take off the table some of the political rancor, hostility, divisiveness that adults bring to the table when they make these decisions.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And, we know that there has been good work and research done on this by people like Catherine Covell and Brian Howe in England and things of sorts like that. And it just seems to me that if we would spend more time looking at those types of opportunities and establishing the importance of those, then we can make headway, I think, in convincing, you might say, more school boards, more legislatures that the voices of children, their participation rights are very critical.
That's right. Yes. And, school boards and administrators, I think of as primary targets for human rights education. I think your first interview with Nancy, right? She talked about like congressional aides as being really important, as targets for human rights education. But I think and I'd never disagree with Nancy, right? I mean, she's always right. But next in line, it definitely have to be school boards, local school boards. Those are made up of people who, run for office out of the community. They don't get paid. They don't have, kind of deep expertise necessarily. They just really generally want what's best for their schools. And so I think offering them support and guidance as to understanding not just the curricular content and possibilities, but the, for and through elements of HRE would go a long way to removing some of those barriers that teachers who are enthusiastic about this often face. And so, my hobby horse would be to, get more presentations at school boards, introducing them to this concept, providing them with materials and support and evidence. They're always looking for evidence-based approaches that would essentially prepare the ground for educators who are really passionate about this.
So, globally speaking, we have this, in my view, very disturbing development of authoritarianism in a number of countries around the world, Russia, Venezuela, and others. And we have an emerging authoritarian political party in this country. So I'm wondering what you see as a way that HRE could be strengthened in the coming years, given this sort of disturbing trend of authoritarianism.
Yeah, you're not alone in finding this deeply disturbing. And, ultimately, I think the greatest current threat to human rights is the resurgence of authoritarianism. For many years, right, within the human rights world, there was this assumption that, everybody agrees that human rights are good. The real question is, how do we implement? How do we get enforcement, right? All of this kind of stuff, particularly after the 1990s, right? After, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of apartheid, there was this kind of human rights triumphalism that, human rights, everybody agrees. What we're seeing is that was a very if it was there at all, it was very weak. And that truly under the surface, there is a real challenge, and there is a real sense by a not insignificant segment of the population around the world that rejects wholeheartedly the idea that every human being is equal and has inherent dignity that should be respected and protected. So how we go at that in the long term absolutely is a human rights education movement and calling. In fact, right, this was at the core of Article 26 in the Universal Declaration. When the framers first wrote that, the original article just had paragraph 1 in it, right? It was all free and compulsory schooling, and, we need to make sure there's access, and which is all very important. But when they were discussing it, it was the representative from the World Jewish Congress, right, the NGO observer, during those deliberations, who spoke up and said, you know what, that's all great, but who had the best education immediately prior to, most universal access to education immediately prior to the Second World War? It was Germany, right? Germany is like this leader in public education for many years in universal access. But that was an education for death. And so, they wrote that paragraph 2, which specifies that the purposes of education have to be for the advancement of human rights. They have to be about the individual human personality, precisely because education had to be a force for the support of democratic values, of inherent and equal dignity. Today, we're seeing that that hasn't been it clearly has not been the case. That's the way that education has been organized. And so the hopeful side says to me, this resurgence of authoritarianism will make people pay attention and realize the essential foundation of education in human rights, in this idea of respect for equal and inherent dignity. The pessimistic side says the authoritarians are winning. They recognize the value of education. They're the ones who are showing up at school board educations, demanding that there be no gender-affirming care, demanding that they remove books from the library. They seem much better organized and aware of the important role of schools and education in this effort. And so, on our side, I think those of us who paid attention know, but one of the challenges is mobilizing the broader public to be aware that this is a critical area that we have to be politically active in.
Well, I couldn't disagree at all. I would argue very much that not only is it critical to sort of mobilize those people in the general public, but it's also to talk about rights beyond political rights. Because too often, I think in the United States, the discussion is about civil and political rights. It's not about economic rights, not about social rights, not about cultural rights. And that, to me, really narrows the conversation so much.
That's right. Yeah. And I think there is some opportunity there, right? In the recent years, the increasing understanding of inequality as a human rights issue, really a kind of legacy, again, going back to that WTO protest in Seattle in '99, and then resurged during the Occupy movement. And then, as you've said many times, right, Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign really gave legitimacy to the idea that inequality itself is a human rights concern. Prior to that, right, it's like human rights is kind of like a floor, right? As long as people have the bare minimum, it's fine. Other people can run off and be the Elon Musk. Increasingly, I think there's an awareness that, the existence of billionaires at all is a concern for those who are interested in human rights and justice. And so I think there's an opening to put those on the table in a way that there hasn't been before. One area where I think there's particular opportunity for human rights educators is to build alliances with teachers in their labor organizing efforts. As you know, the labor movement in the past 30 years has declined rapidly. There's recent kind of evidence that it's maybe bouncing back and we're getting some expansion. But one area where it remains strong is in the public sector and among teachers. And the teacher actions in places like Arizona and West Virginia and California in recent years has demonstrated that these can be powerful, winning, popular arguments about the basic economic justice for teachers that I think is a human rights argument. And I think human rights educators should be a part of that in some significant way.
And I would expand that to include the thousands, tens of thousands of people who are part-time instructors in higher education, because they're now the largest labor force in higher education in many parts of the country.
Well, thank you for that. That's absolutely right. I mean, as someone who is a non-tenured track, contingent faculty, lecturers, you're absolutely right. Again, the kind of structural changes in universities that have increasingly moved away from hiring tenure line faculty and toward contingent part-time faculty. Part of that is about an economic argument that leaves the faculty in precarious positions. And so they're not going to speak up. They're not going to criticize the administration lest they lose their job. So that kind of labor organizing is essential for lecturers and adjuncts to just get a basic minimum wage. But then it's also essential to protect our academic freedom and our freedom of speech so that we're not afraid to speak out against an administration acting in ways that are counter to fundamental human rights values.
Yeah, and I think, close to where I live, the big strike at Rutgers last year was very much focused on trying to tell the message that contingent faculty who were then allied with the full-time faculty needed to have much better benefits, much better pay, and also to recognize that the university community and the state itself would recognize how significant those roles are in higher education today. So let me turn to our last question here, which is in three parts, and that is, who would be the most influential role model for your work in human rights education? I would say living or deceased.
So thinking about, you give this question to everyone. So I listened to everybody's answer previously, and there's a lot of great work in there, and they stole a lot of good names. But I want to go back to your question about popular education and to think about that. And so I want to put into the mix the name Miles Horton, who was the head of the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And really a transformative, non-formal educator, one dedicated to the principle that poor people knew what their problems were and knew how to solve them. They needed space to organize and systematize what they knew, and then to put that into action together. And the Highlander Folk School, of course, was famous for being the seedbed of the civil rights movement. They convened a series of workshops in the mid-1950s that, had Martin Luther King, had Rosa Parks, had Septima Clark, and others there to strategize and to develop the relationships that would carry the movement through. And Horton really, like Freire, had a set of critical pedagogical principles. But unlike Freire, he didn't write a lot. He was someone who existed to elevate the voices of others and to support their capacity and ability to organize and elevate for themselves. And I find that really inspiring. And I find that kind of role of being an enabler and a supporter as the kind of critical function that we need today. So yeah, Miles Horton.
Okay, and then what quote most effectively sums up your view of the importance of human rights education or human rights?
So this move I'm going to make now from Miles Horton to Hannah Arendt is a kind of classic academic, right? So from like these popular educators to, one of the most famous academic critical theorists. But I do think, Hannah Arendt had a lot to teach us, and her voice resonates really clearly with me and with my students today. And her famous book, The Origin of Totalitarianism, unpacking the kind of longue durée history of the rise of Nazism, but also Stalinist totalitarianism. Gave us the term or the idea of the right to have rights as being the most fundamental human right. So this is from that. She says, this new situation, by which she means the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, in which, quote, humanity has in effect assumed the role formerly ascribed to nature or history, would mean in this context that the right to have rights, or the right of every individual to belong to humanity, should be guaranteed by humanity itself. It is by no means certain whether this is possible. I think this idea, of course, that human rights needs to be something not only kind of protected at the level of international and national system, but guaranteed by humanity itself, that humanity needs to begin to think of itself as a community that recognizes and protects the rights of all, is a critical question for human rights. And then she ends by saying she's not certain it can happen. I think that's the other thing, is that we can't presume that, as Barack Obama used to say, that the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. It doesn't automatically bend toward justice. It bends away from justice, actually, more often than it bends toward justice. It only bends towards justice if we put our backs into it and do the bending ourselves. And so, the precariousness and the contingency and the possibility that this is all not going to work has to be kept in mind as we do the human rights work, the kind of seriousness of the threat, if we are actually going to make progress on any of this.
Yeah, I'm very intrigued by your use of Hannah Arendt, because I think a lot of people hear her name, but they don't really know where she came from. And she endured an enormous amount of suffering herself before she ended up in the United States, right, at the New School. And many years ago, I knew Henry Friedlander at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and he talked to me about Hannah Arendt and how she was one of the first significant women philosophers, political philosophers, that was trained in Germany. And actually her background in her studies was in Greek philosophy. So, she brings an awful lot of intellectual weight and credibility to that argument, I think.
That's right. Yeah, no, that background is absolutely true. It's also true that her dissertation advisor was Martin Heidegger, the man who was rector of the University of Freiburg and implemented the Nazi policies there, right? So Heidegger, this huge name in Western philosophy, essentially was a Nazi apparatchik, right? And, Arendt's relationship to him is very complicated and fraught. I think it's exactly that recognition about both the importance and significance of this classical philosophical tradition and the way in which the legacy of the Enlightenment allows for the possibility of universal human rights, at the same time that there's a dark side to modernity, and that, the heirs to the Greeks are both the human rights advocates and the human rights perpetrators, that there's this kind of double-faced European civilization, which people like Gandhi knew all of the time, but, during the Second World War became increasingly apparent to Western academics.
And so lastly, what would be the one recommendation you would make to advance human rights education in the United States at this time?
So one recommendation to advance human rights education is a tough one, right? Again, we face multiple crises on many different fronts, and, addressing them all simultaneously with multiple projects in multiple directions is the only way it's going to work. But you've given me this question, so I have to answer. I guess if there could be one thing, if I could wave a magic wand, I would say the establishment of a National Truth Commission with respect to Native American dispossession and genocide would be a critical foundation for the advance of human rights education throughout the country. Without that initial, right, and quickly following on that might be a truth commission about slavery, but Native genocide and dispossession is the kind of founding sin of the United States, and a national official commitment to document that, to acknowledge that, to provide for a space for the sharing of stories about its long and ongoing impact, I think would spur the kind of conversations, commitments, the development of material, and a transformation. I mean, we talked about this when we talked about citizenship education, in the historic memory of what this country is about, that opens the door to human rights education in new and exciting ways. Under no illusion that is going to happen. I don't have a magic wand, but I think if there was one thing that might happen that would be set off a chain reaction, it could be that.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned it in terms of looking at the legacy and the history of Native Americans, because, as you know, there have been truth commissions in other countries. There was a truth commission in South Africa, a truth commission in Guatemala, and so forth. But I'm not convinced that those truth commissions really went deeply into the history of those countries. I think they went into more recent atrocities. So you're asking for something rather comprehensive, much more so than those, correct?
That's right. I mean, I think, that is the way in which most truth commissions get formed, is in response to a proximate crime. In fact, they get formed generally as an excuse for not bringing charges and putting people on trial. But what I think they've demonstrated in their form is the value of constructing a new and different historical memory, that they do begin to document the period of atrocity, but they often then have to go back, right? Because the periods of authoritarianism don't exist in a vacuum, right? They emerge out of a longer history. And the ability to construct those longer histories in a kind of open, democratic, forum like a truth commission adds weight, draws attention. The California state, has a reparations commission that issued its first report for African Americans. They've gone deeper into that history than most truth commissions, and it's not just approximate crime. It goes all the way back to the founding of the state. So I think increasingly, while they did emerge in the context of transitional justice after authoritarian regimes, the value of truth or what sometimes gets called historical commissions, has been demonstrated to be really powerful over a longer term.
Well, Glenn, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I wanted to thank you very much for spending time with us today, and I hope that we can continue it in the future.
Of course. Yeah, no, it was my pleasure, Bill. You're a great interviewer. I always love talking to you. I don't know if you're ever going to interview yourself, but you as, I listen to the Nancy Flowers and David Scheinman, the history that they tell as a historian, like the story of the origin and past and the emergence of human rights education, which I know you were a fundamental part of, is just so amazing and fascinating. So, if you haven't already, you should plan to do a flipped podcast where you get to you get interviewed. And if nobody's going to do it, I volunteer. So have me back.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HREUSA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Pocket Casts, Player FM and Deezer. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy at hreusa.org. That's KRISTI at hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Rudelius-Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Jessica Terbruggen, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.